Several days ago, President Donald Trump ordered troops into Portland, Oregon. He had a bunch of claims that are being attacked and dismissed as not being legitimate. But there's something bigger going on here, and it is very important. And I wanted to talk to Professor Kristen Van Biezenbos, who is a professor of law at the California Western School of Law in San Diego. I've interviewed her many times before. We've talked about this in more general terms. So welcome to the interview, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Markham. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'll talk about in a minute about what President Trump ordered, but I want to structure the interview so that viewers know what's coming. So we're going to talk about what he did. Then we're going to talk about an article that you and I have read from Foreign Affairs magazine called Ungoverning America, which I think for at least for me, for the first time, the penny dropped. And I began to understand, oh, that's his strategy. So folks, you want to really pay attention to this because this is an interesting structure within which to think about Donald Trump. And then, of course, we'll get into some of your arguments, which are sort of the legal and constitutional limits to his authority. So I want to start here. When I interviewed you last in January, we talked about this, and you said, we hope that the constitutional guardrails that are in place to constrain the power of the executive, Trump, will hold. What do you think of that argument now? Are they holding?
I would say right now they're under serious strain. So the two biggest checks on the power of the executive are Congress and the Supreme Court. Congress, right now, both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, are dominated by Republicans, although they have a thin margin. They are able to defeat motions by Democrats. So Congress has been largely letting the president do whatever he wants to do, even when it seems to be pretty clearly in contravention of legislation. So Congress's own view of certain situations has been overruled by the president with no real pushback from Congress at all. And then we have the Supreme Court, which, this is something we can talk about in terms of why the Supreme Court hasn't done more. Right now, the Supreme Court has been acting primarily on what many people call the shadow docket, which I'm happy to discuss that with you. But through the shadow docket, the Supreme Court has mostly been enabling the Trump administration without actually ruling on the merits of anything that they've done so far.
So we've got ourselves or the Americans have got themselves into a situation where they have a president who's willing to push against the guardrails, the constitutional guardrails. And then the logical question is why? And this is where I want to get into Ungoverned America, the logic behind Trump's assault on the administrative state by Russell Muirhead, Nancy L. Rosenblum in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs. And the argument here is that Trump has no intention to govern. And this might be the first president in my experience that was elected to govern, but his goal is to essentially dismantle and disable the state, the machinery of the state, and then to remake it in a way that brings much more power and authority to the executive, him, and takes it away from other areas of government like Congress and the Supreme Court. That's the argument. What do you make of that?
I think there's something to be said for it. I think if you were trying to come up looking at what Trump has done since Inauguration Day, and he's certainly done a lot, but when you look at all the things he's done, it's difficult to discern a governing strategy. It's hard to see what his vision for the government is, because most of what he's been doing is dismantling the administrative state, which the administrative agencies are actually part of the executive. So it feels strange that a president would want to sort of defang them and defund them and dissolve many of the agencies, because the agencies are under the president's supervision. However, it does make sense when you think about the fact that the agencies will always be constrained by congressional legislation that empowers them. That's what the agencies do. They're part of the executive, but they execute the will of Congress. So if you're trying to essentially make Congress powerless to resist the president, getting rid of the administrative state, or at least hobbling it significantly, does make sense. And then just pushing back against all of the norms, just trying to, a lot of the things that the Trump administration have done have really hurt America and Americans. And the only real explanation that I can see for that is that it's all part of a quest to just centralize power by undoing the diffusion of power throughout the administrative state. So a lot of Congress's powers have been delegated to the administrative state. By getting rid of it, you essentially force Congress into the position where either they do those things or it doesn't happen. And because Congress has been so unable to get anything done during this administration, except to essentially rubber stamp the president's decisions, by getting rid of the administrative state, you've essentially removed legislative guardrails from what the president does.
How much more strain can those guardrails take? Because it seems like it's only 9 months, 8 months.
No.
Yeah, and he's dismantled so much of it already, or weakened it, and from Doge to this is not the first time he's deployed federal troops to ICE and immigration crackdowns, and I mean, there's just a long, long list of all the things that the presidency, the Trump administration has done. How much more strain can those guardrails take?
Well, I think one of the things that we haven't seen yet is what happens if he faces real resistance from within the government. So if during the midterms, which are in 2026 next year, the Democrats were to take power of one or both of the houses of Congress, then we would see whether or not the guardrails are still there. The problem is right now that Congress is so complicit with what the president is doing, whether that's because they agree with him or because they feel like they can't object. We don't know if that guardrail is holding at all because right now it's just kind of not doing anything. And then the Supreme Court has made the decision, I think, to try to avoid a constitutional crisis by not actually ruling on the merits of what the president has done, which has allowed them to essentially at least maintain the facade of not taking a side, even though it feels like they're taking a side, by continuously upholding the actions of what the president has done, even though they haven't answered whether it's legal or not. And so I think right now, we don't actually know if the guardrails have become completely ineffective because we haven't seen them really have the opportunity to take a stand, I suppose. If the Democrats are able to take control of one or both of the houses of Congress, then we might see Congress stand up to the president. And if the Supreme Court actually strikes down some of the things the president has done, it puts him in the position of, well, now will you actually ignore the Supreme Court? Because until the Supreme Court actually makes a decision on the merits, he can pretend like even if he ignores one of their interim orders, their emergency orders, is he really not complying? He can sort of get away with that kind of gray zone. But if they were to say this is unconstitutional and then he does it anyway, that's a constitutional crisis.
Well, let's talk about some of the legal and constitutional issues that pertain to his deployment of troops in Portland. And we should make the point here that they haven't been deployed yet. It takes some period of time before orders are issued, troops are mobilized. It might be a week or two if they do show up in Portland before they actually get there. So
Yes.
he said they're going to do it, but it's not happening quite yet. So one of the guardrails is the Posse Comitatus Act. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Yes, you are.
Could you explain that to us, please?
The Posse Comitatus Act prevents the president from using the military essentially to act as law enforcement without the request of state governors. So the last time the Posse Comitatus Act or the Insurrection Act is the exception to that. So generally speaking, the president doesn't have the power to mobilize the military in the states without their request, unless they ask for help, which none of the states where the military has been deployed, except for Memphis, I suppose, has actually asked for this to happen. So it is a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act unless there is an area, and again, a lot of this, the Trump administration is taking advantage of gray areas that exist because no president has ever tried to do this before. So it's more like unanswered questions. But there is an inherent authority of the executive as the commander in chief to send the military to protect federal personnel and federal operations. So it does seem like it might be legal for him to send the Marines, for example, to Seattle, but all they could do is to protect federal property. So ICE headquarters, for example, which is what they did in LA. They just stood outside of ICE headquarters. But they can't actually take part in law enforcement activity. If they did that, if they actually mobilized as a military force to arrest civilians, attack civilians, take any type of military action or forceful physical action against an American citizen, that would probably be a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. It's a really narrow window to protect federal operations and federal property for the military, but they're not ever supposed to act as a military force against the American people.
Now, my understanding is that the Insurrection Act of 1807 does give him a little bit more leeway. Could you explain that, please?
Well, yes, if there were actually an insurrection, so that means an anti-government force were to try to overthrow the federal or perhaps a state government, it would be possible to use the military to do that. The Insurrection Act has only been used in very limited circumstances. I think the last time it was used was during the Civil Rights era to protect children who were attending newly desegregated schools. And it was at the request of state governors as well. So in theory, it didn't actually violate Posse Comitatus, but the difference was that the military was actually acting as a type of law enforcement force to bolster local police. But there is no insurrection, at least not by, there hasn't been, one of the things that he is trying to do, I think, is to lay the legal groundwork for maybe saying that there is one with his most recent executive order saying they were going to go after domestic terrorists. I'm not sure if your listeners would remember, but back, I believe it was in 2020 during the first Trump administration, there were some violent protests against Trump administration policies in Portland. And Portland is seen by some conservatives as a hotbed for Antifa, the anti-fascist movement, and Antifa is the group that he labeled a domestic terrorist group in his executive order.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment because he mentioned Antifa. And I saw a great comment on that on X today, where the commenter said, it's like declaring war on punk rock.
Yeah,
You can't declare war on an adjective.
it's true.
And there is no Antifa group. There is no
That's right.
Antifa cell. There is none of that. It's kind
That's
of
right.
just if you're against fascism, that makes you Antifa. And who isn't against
Isn't.
fascism?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that is first of all, there is no piece of legislation that domestic terrorist is a term that certainly one could use, but it doesn't actually have any legal meaning. There's no legislation that activates some kind of presidential power if you declare some group to be domestic terrorists. So that's sort of an empty term. It doesn't have any legal effect. But then there's the fact that there is no Antifa. I mean, that is only describing people who are connected by their resistance to fascism, which that describes a lot of left-leaning groups and perhaps some right-leaning groups too.
And plenty of us in the middle.
I would think that that would be a label that most people would be comfortable with having applied to them, you would think.
Indeed. The third guardrail we want to talk about is state sovereignty and consent issues.
Yes.
Maybe you could talk about that.
So the National Guard, this has to do with the mobilization of the National Guard in American cities. So the National Guard, despite the name, the Guard is located in every state. All 50 states have a National Guard, and they actually operate at the behest of the state governor. So they are state forces, and they are there in the event that the U.S. was ever invaded. They serve as a local military force to repel foreign invasion. They have been mobilized before, though. I mean, every state has a standing National Guard, and people, I mean, they're mostly on reserve with some people on active duty. Now, the National Guard it's activated generally at the request of the state governor. For example, California's National Guard is supposed to be under the authority of the governor of California. However, if states ask for help from the president, it is possible to send National Guard troops from other states as long as those states also agree. And that has set up, well, first of all, we have a problem where the legality of sending the National Guard to states that don't actually ask and in fact insist that they not be there is tenuous at best. They should not be there if the state has said, please do not send them. And then there's the problem that the states that are volunteering the use of their National Guard are Republican states. So that's setting up a situation where you have National Guard from red states being sent primarily to cities in blue states, which again is politicizing something that probably shouldn't be happening, but it adds an extra layer of this feeling that places that don't support Trump are being targeted for punishment.
Kristen, I have to say, the conversation so far, it looks like Trump is pushing. He's testing. He's
Mhm.
looking for weak spots. How far can I go? How much will they let me get away with before, somebody pushes back legally or there are protests in the street or whatever it might be? And it's rather shocking to an observer, from Canada that there really hasn't been much resistance at this point. And he pushes, he tests. Oh, I can go that far. Well, let me go. I'll go a little further the next time. Is that a useful way to look at this?
I think what Trump is doing is a combination of things. I think to the extent that there is a sort of method to the madness, a lot of that is coming from Project 2025. So people like Russell Vought and others have really thought about some of these things and how you would actually sort of dismantle the American state and reform it with a sort of figurehead, a president with absolute power. And then I think a lot of this stuff just comes from Trump being a reactionary person. He sees something, he gets angry, and he lashes out. So he says, let's do it. And then people try to make it happen, people working on his behalf. I think the reason why he's getting away with a lot of it right now is because there's a few things, but I think one thing is no unified leadership against him. So since Congress won't do anything, when he's attacking individual states, you don't see groups of states getting together to resist him, right? It's he picks on them one by one to make it difficult for them. It's just one state now versus Trump, the power of the federal government. And he's got this spending power, so he keeps threatening to pull federal money from the states, and that's a lot of money in many cases. And then similarly with universities in Hollywood, he's picking on specific companies, specific universities, going after those places and leaving them in a position where they feel essentially alone to negotiate with him, which is a difficult feeling because there's a lot of money on the line. And I think that that's part what we're seeing is there isn't really like a centralized group or a centralized power that speaks on behalf of the sectors that he's been attacking. And that makes it hard to fight.
We should make the point here because you've talked a number of times about authorization by governors and so on. The Oregon governor is Tina Kotek, and the Portland mayor is Keith Wilson, and both of them have strongly rejected the Trump sending announcement that he's going to deploy troops, and
Yeah.
they just argue that look, there's no current lawlessness, and in fact, some observers have pointed out that in the first half of 2025, crime actually fell in Portland and Oregon generally. So, does this mean that if there are enough people like the governor and the mayor and others pushing back hard, that might make Trump rethink his move here?
So I think one thing is that it opens him up to lawsuits. So in California, obviously, California sued the Trump administration. Um, Illinois sued Texas for being willing to send their National Guard to Illinois when the governor of Illinois said no, and the mayor of Chicago said no. And so, it's there's again a lot of the stuff he's doing is really unprecedented. So it's not you have this feeling that it can't be right, but since no one's ever done it before, there isn't always a law in the books that says you can't do this. So I think maybe what Trump is doing now is I'm not sure that he's going to try to send the National Guard from another state because after what happened in California, there's law from the Ninth Circuit, at least, which Oregon is a part of, that suggests that you cannot do that. Although I think the Court of Appeals may not necessarily agree. But he still has that power as the commander in chief to send the military to protect federal operations and federal buildings, and that is a thing. Reality seems to be against the idea that federal operations and federal property needs to be protected. As you say, plenty of people have posted videos that show there have been some, I think, anti-ICE protests in Portland, but I don't get the impression that they're any worse or more violent than, protests in other places. I think this is really, there was a story on Fox News and it got Trump upset. So now he's going to send the Marines or some other military group there, and then they'll stand around like they did in Los Angeles, protecting buildings.
Let's talk about the last guardrail here, at least the one we're going to discuss today, and that's due process and civil liberties.
Mhm.
Um, is that any kind of a guardrail on President Trump?
It's supposed to be. I think that I am not an expert in immigration law. I think where we're seeing due process really being disregarded entirely is in the immigration context, especially when it comes to people who are undocumented. But the treatment of even people who are here under visas that are valid, and even people who have green cards, and occasionally American citizens too, would suggest that due process is not really being honored. I think part of the problem here is that the Trump administration is filled with people who don't seem to know much about the Constitution. And I'm not sure that they fully understand what the Constitution says with respect to due process, because the due process requirement is a constitutional limit on the power of the federal government, full stop. So it doesn't matter if the person that you are arresting without due process or trying to deport without due process is an American citizen or not. It's not a positive privilege that is granted to American citizens. It is a restraint on the American government. So I do think that this guardrail is not holding up. I think that courts are fighting against it, but for some reason, and if you'd like to talk about that, we can. The Supreme Court has been using the shadow docket to remove stays and injunctions to stop the federal government from doing that.
Maybe you could just explain briefly what what the shadow docket is.
Of course. So that's not its real name. There isn't an official name for this. But so ordinarily, the Supreme Court accepts appeals from state Supreme Courts and the federal courts of appeal. And to get that, you apply for, it's called certiorari. The Supreme Court doesn't accept certiorari for many cases. It gets hundreds of thousands of applications, and it accepts somewhere on the order of 80 cases a year. However, for cases that are in the federal courts of appeal, a lot of times what judges will do when they're considering the merits is they will say, if you're challenging government action, while I, the federal circuit, the judge at the Federal Circuit Court of Appeal is considering this, I'm going to put a stay on what the federal government is doing until I figure out whether it's legal. So the shadow docket is the government saying to the Supreme Court, this case is still before the Court of Appeals. I'm asking you to lift the stay. So sometimes it's called the emergency docket, but for these emergency orders that are putting a hold on what the federal government is doing while the courts consider the legality, the federal government is going to the Supreme Court and saying, lift the hold. And they're doing it with no explanation a lot of the time.
Ah, I see. Okay, that makes sense. Now, you earlier in the interview, you talked about Project 2025, and
Yes.
I think we should spend a little bit of time on that because long after the election, I came across it and I thought, well, I'm going to read some of this. Boy, what an eye opener that was. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of it's like the Trump administration to some extent is working from a template, a game
Yeah.
plan that was
Mhm.
set out in Project 2025. And the primary purpose of Project 2025, which is a creation of the Heritage Foundation,
Mhm.
is essentially the dissolution, the crippling, the removal of the administrative state, all of the machinery of bureaucracy and rules and regulations and so on. That is anyway. Could maybe just as a professor of law, if you could address the importance or the implications of Project 2025 for this conversation.
I'd say the important thing to know about Project 2025, it's a roadmap for remaking America into a white Christian state. So to do that, you have to get rid of, well, one thing is you have to get rid of parts of the Constitution that specifically prohibit the creation of an official religion. And then you also have to undo civil rights protections, which we're already beginning to see with the attack on DEI. Because if you want to create like a Christian ethno state where Christian values are the guiding principles behind the US government, behind laws, behind the way that things are governed, in order to do that, you have to dismantle the administrative state. And in fact, you have to get rid of any entity, whether it's Congress or the Supreme Court, that would try to enforce the provisions of the Constitution on the president.
Okay. I mean, I think what we've got here, the ungoverned article has given us some insight into the strategy. We now know what some of the guardrails are here and the extent to which and how the Trump administration is pushing and to see if they'll hold. We've got the game plan, in a sense, in Project 2025, based on, I know it's hard to look into a crystal ball and talk about the future, but maybe just your thoughts on what might happen over the next 6 to 12, maybe 12 months, maybe 24 months.
It's hard to predict the future. When you asked me in January, I had my fears, but I never could have foreseen what's been happening in the past almost 9 months, or I guess 9 months since then. I hesitate to make any predictions, but I think what we will see, Trump and his policies are deeply unpopular. Most of the people who voted for him, of course, not the people who really love him, they just love him and don't think that he can do anything wrong. But he managed to sway a lot of voters who had not voted for him or Republicans before because he promised to revitalize the economy, to bring down prices, to do something about wealth inequality. And all of those things have gotten worse. So he continues to become increasingly unpopular. But he is also weakening American faith in American institutions. They no longer believe in entities like the CDC. When they give recommendations, there's a feeling that they'll just say whatever they're told to say. So I think we're looking at growing resistance, but I think he is succeeding in the sense that he is seriously eroding the trust in the American people, in the American government, which is part of what he's trying to do. So I can't make any specific predictions, but I do think that he is going to start facing some real pushback. But even so, we still need Democrats or some other party to come up with a clear vision for governing that can get people back on board with the promise of the American government.
So you've laid out a number of themes here, and I think it's fair to say that the overarching theme is that Trump is kicking the stuffing out of the status quo and precedent and the way things have been done, whether it was a Democrat or Republican administration and Congress. So he's doing that. And now the question is, how will the guardrails hold? How will people respond? And so on, which just means more of the same going forward, I would think.
I think it's going to be more chaos, more lawsuits. But you are going to see, I think the midterms are coming. So we'll see what happens there. Trump is actively trying to force redistricting in Republican states to erase any advantage that the Democrats have. And polling suggests they do have a serious advantage, even though the Democratic sort of brand is very tarnished. And the Supreme Court is running out of time. They are going to have to take certiorari and actually decide some of what Trump has done on the merits and say that's legal or it's not. They'll have to take a stand.
So we've got some issues coming to a head. Might be some
Yes.
conflict, lots of politics, lots of maybe a constitutional crisis. From a news point of view, you couldn't ask for anything better.
There's definitely a lot going. It's not boring. Yeah.
Lawyers and journalists always benefit
right.
from this kind.
That's
Kristen,
right.
thank you very much for this. We'll be checking in with you later on this fall, kind of keep our fingers on the pulse, but thank you very much.
Thank you.